So let's talk about Aquaman, the 2018 DC Extended Universe film that completely blew audiences away when it first hit theaters. You know, before this movie came out, a lot of people were genuinely skeptical. I mean, Aquaman is a solo film? The guy who talks to fish? Come on. But director James Wan had something totally different in mind. And what he delivered was one of the most visually spectacular superhero films ever made. This isn't just some underwater adventure slapped together to fill a slot in the DC lineup. This is a full-blown epic with heart, humor, stunning world-building, and action sequences that honestly made your jaw drop. Whether you were a longtime DC fan or someone who just wandered into the theater because everything else was sold out, Aquaman gave you something to remember. So grab your popcorn because we're diving deep into everything this film has to offer. And trust me, there is a lot to unpack here. Let's start with the basic premise of the film, because understanding where the story begins is really the foundation of everything else that follows. The movie centers on Arthur Curry, a half-human, half-Atlantean man who exists between two worlds and feels fully comfortable in neither. His mother, Queen Atlanta, was an Atlantean who fled an arranged marriage and washed ashore in Maine, where she fell in love with a lighthouse keeper named Tom Curry. Together, they had Arthur, who inherited extraordinary abilities from his Atlantean heritage. But Atlanta was eventually recaptured by Atlantean soldiers and forced to return to the underwater kingdom, leaving young Arthur and his father behind. Fast forward to the present day, and Arthur is living his life as a kind of wandering hero, helping people when he can, but largely avoiding the responsibilities that come with his royal bloodline. The central conflict of the film kicks off when his half-brother Orm, the current ruler of Atlantis, begins plotting to unite the 7 underwater kingdoms under his command and wage war against the surface world. Arthur is essentially the only one who has the legitimate claim to the throne of Atlantis, being the firstborn son of Atlanta, and he becomes the unlikely candidate to stop Orm's catastrophic plan before millions of lives are lost. The story is a classic hero's journey wrapped inside an absolutely breathtaking underwater mythology, and it works on almost every level you can think of. Now, speaking of the characters, let's get into who actually populates this world, because Aquaman as a film is genuinely rich with memorable personalities. At the center of it all is Arthur Curry himself, played by Jason Momoa, who had already given audiences a taste of this character in Justice League. Arthur is funny, brash, a little reckless, and deeply conflicted about his identity. He loves the surface world because that's where he grew up, where his father is, where he understands the rules of life. But he's also drawn to Atlantis whether he likes it or not, because that's where half of his heritage lies. Then you have Mera, played by Amber Heard, who serves as Arthur's guide into the Atlantean world and eventually becomes his partner in every sense of the word. Mera is disciplined, brilliant, and doesn't have a lot of patience for Arthur's casual attitude toward his destiny. Their dynamic is one of the most entertaining things about the film. You've also got Orm, played by Patrick Wilson, who functions as the primary antagonist, but is written with enough nuance that you can actually understand his perspective, even if you don't agree with his methods. King Nereus, played by Dolph Lundgren, is another major player as the ruler of one of the underwater kingdoms who aligns himself with Orm for complex political reasons. And then there's Volko, played by Willem Dafoe, Arthur's Atlantean mentor, who secretly trained him as a child and has been working behind the scenes for years to ensure that Arthur would one day claim his rightful place. Each of these characters brings something unique to the table, and the film does a surprisingly good job of making sure they all have clearly defined motivations. Building on that, let's talk specifically about Jason Momoa's performance, because honestly, it's impossible to discuss Aquaman without spending some serious time on what he brings to this role. Momoa had a massive challenge going in. He needed to take a character that many people considered a joke, a guy in a yellow and green suit who rides seahorses, and make him genuinely cool, compelling, and emotionally resonant. And you know what? He absolutely nailed it. Momoa brings this incredible physicality to Arthur that makes the character feel truly superhuman. Every movement, every fight sequence, every moment where Arthur is navigating the ocean feels authentic and powerful. But what makes Momoa's performance truly great isn't just the action stuff. It's the quieter moments. The scene where Arthur visits his father. The scenes where he grapples with whether he belongs in Atlantis or on the surface. The moments where his humor masks a deeper uncertainty about who he is and where he belongs. Momoa plays all of that with a warmth and a naturalness that keeps the character grounded even when everything around him is spectacularly over the top. He makes Arthur feel like a real person who just happens to be able to breathe underwater and punch submarines. There's a genuine charisma to Momoa that elevates every scene he's in, and it's hard to imagine any other actor pulling this off with the same level of success. And since we're on the subject of performance, we absolutely cannot skip over Amber Heard's portrayal of Mera, because she holds her own beautifully against Momoa and brings a completely different but equally important energy to the film. Mera is one of the most capable characters in the movie. She's a warrior, a tactician, a princess with real political savvy, and she has hydrokinetic powers that allow her to manipulate water in extraordinary ways. Heard plays her with a kind of precise intensity that contrasts brilliantly with Momoa's more laid-back approach. In a lesser film, Mera might have just been the love interest, the beautiful sidekick who tags along and gets rescued a few times. But Aquaman gives her genuine agency. She's often the one driving the plot forward, making the critical decisions, saving Arthur just as often as he saves her. There's a fantastic scene in Sicily where Mera has to navigate the surface world for the first time, and Heard plays the fish-out-of-water comedy with perfect timing, while never letting you forget that Mera is fundamentally a serious, powerful person. The chemistry between Heard and Momoa is electric, and their relationship develops in a way that feels earned rather than forced. By the time they reach the emotional peak of their story together, you're genuinely invested in them as a couple. Now let's turn our attention to the villain, because a superhero movie is only as good as its antagonist, and Orm is a genuinely compelling one. Patrick Wilson's performance as Ocean Master is one of the most underrated villain portrayals in recent superhero cinema, and that's not an exaggeration. What makes Orm interesting is that he's not simply evil for the sake of being evil. He genuinely believes in what he's doing. From his perspective, the surface world has spent decades polluting the oceans, dumping garbage and toxins into the seas that his people call home. He sees himself as a defender of his civilization, someone taking righteous action against a world that has shown nothing but contempt and carelessness toward the oceans. Now, obviously, his solution, which involves assembling a massive military coalition and launching a catastrophic war against humanity, is extreme and ultimately unconscionable. But Wilson plays the character with such conviction and such wounded pride that you can trace the logic of his thinking even when you're rooting against him. Orm also has a complicated relationship with Arthur that adds real emotional texture to their conflict. He grew up without his mother because of the surface world, and he resents Arthur for existing as a symbol of that connection. Their rivalry isn't just political, it's deeply personal, and Wilson and Momoa bring that tension to life brilliantly in every scene they share. Let's also spend some time talking about Vulko, because Willem Dafoe's portrayal of this mentor figure is wonderfully layered and adds a great deal of depth to the story's mythology. Vulko is the royal advisor to Atlantis, a man who has served the kingdom for generations and who secretly harbors loyalty not to Orm, but to the idea of a rightful king. He recognized Arthur's potential from early childhood and arranged for the boy to be trained in Atlantean combat and culture, all without anyone in the royal court knowing. Dafoe brings his characteristic intelligence and intensity to the role, and he makes Vulko feel like a man carrying the weight of decades of careful planning and patient waiting. The flashback sequences showing young Arthur training with Vulko are some of the most charming in the film, giving us a sense of how Arthur developed his skills and his complicated feelings about his heritage. Vulko's ultimate loyalty and what he's willing to sacrifice for the sake of what he believes is right adds genuine dramatic weight to the film's later acts, and Dafoe handles those moments with real gravitas. Moving forward, let's dig into the world building, because one of the things Aquaman does better than almost any other superhero film is create an entirely convincing alternate civilization beneath the ocean. Director James Wan and his creative team didn't just slap some blue filters on the camera and call it a day. They built entire kingdoms with their own distinct visual identities, their own cultures, their own political structures, and their own sense of history. Atlantis itself is a gleaming, impossibly beautiful city that feels genuinely alien and wondrous. The architecture is massive and ornate, drawing on influences from ancient civilizations while pushing everything into a fantastical direction that feels genuinely otherworldly. But beyond Atlantis, the film introduces us to several other underwater kingdoms, each with its own look and personality. The Kingdom of the Fishermen, ruled by King Riku, has a bioluminescent, almost dreamlike quality. The Kingdom of the Brine is darker and more militaristic, home to crab-like warriors. The Trench is terrifying, populated by ancient, monstrous creatures that represent the deepest, most primal fears of the ocean. Each of these locations feels distinct and fully realized, and the cumulative effect is of a world that extends far beyond what any single film could fully explore. It's the kind of world building that makes you want to know more, that leaves you with the sense that there are countless stories still waiting to be told in these depths. The mythology of Atlantis is also handled with a real sense of care and intelligence that sets the film apart from more superficial superhero fare. The story of how Atlantis sank beneath the waves, the history of the Seven Kingdoms, the legend of the Trident of Atlan, All of it is woven together in a way that feels cohesive and internally consistent. The trident serves as the film's central MacGuffin, the ancient weapon of the first king of Atlantis that grants its wielder supreme authority over all the ocean kingdoms. Arthur's quest to find the trident before Orm does drives the second half of the film, and it takes our heroes on a globe-trotting adventure that spans the Sahara Desert, the ancient ruins of Sicily, and ultimately the legendary lost kingdom of the deserters, where the trident has been hidden for centuries. This adventure structure gives the film a Raiders of the Lost Ark quality that keeps the energy high and the story moving at a satisfying pace. Let's talk about the direction of James Wan, because his role in making Aquaman the film, cannot be overstated. Wan came to this project best known for his work in horror, having directed the Saw franchise Insidious and The Conjuring. Many people wondered whether a horror director was the right choice for a big, colorful underwater superhero epic. But Wan proved that his skills translate beautifully to this kind of material. What he brought from horror is a real understanding of how to build tension, how to use space and scale to create a sense of awe or dread, and how to pace a story so that quieter character moments don't kill the momentum, but actually enhance it. Wan also has a genuine love for adventure cinema, and that love is evident in every frame of Aquaman. He directed with an almost childlike sense of wonder, as if he was constantly asking himself how to make the next scene even more spectacular than the last. The result is a film that genuinely feels like a grand adventure in the old Hollywood tradition, updated with modern visual effects technology that allows for imagery no filmmaker could have achieved even a decade earlier. On the subject of the screenplay, the script for Aquaman was written by David Leslie Johnson McGoldrick and Will Beall, based on a story developed with James Wan. The screenplay went through considerable development, with Wan having a significant hand in shaping the narrative to match his visual ambitions for the film. The writers faced an interesting challenge in adapting Aquaman for the screen, because the character has decades of comic book history to draw from, but much of that history is either obscure or, frankly, difficult to adapt in a way that would appeal to mainstream audiences. The solution was to create a story that honored the spirit and mythology of the comics while constructing something that could stand completely on its own for viewers who had never read a single Aquaman comic book. The screenplay strikes a good balance between humor and earnestness, understanding that a story about an underwater king needs to be fun and adventurous, but also needs genuine emotional stakes to work. There are some structural elements that feel familiar: the Chosen One narrative, the quest for a magical artifact, the rival brother storyline. But the execution is fresh enough that these familiar beats don't feel tired. The film was, of course, produced by Warner Brothers Pictures and DC Films, with Peter Safran serving as one of the key producers alongside Rob Cowan. Safran had previously worked with James Wan on several of his horror projects, and their established working relationship contributed significantly to the smooth creative process behind Aquaman. The production also involved producers from Atomic Monster, Wan's production company, which gave him additional creative control over the final product. The budget for the film was substantial, reportedly around $200 million, reflecting the scale of what Wan and his team were attempting to achieve. When you see the finished film, every dollar of that budget is visible on screen. From the elaborate underwater sets to the thousands of digital elements that populate each frame, to the intricate costume design that had to work both in water and out of it. Speaking of budget and production, the making of Aquaman was a genuinely extraordinary undertaking from a technical standpoint. Filming underwater sequences in a way that looks natural and beautiful is notoriously difficult. Many films that attempt it end up with footage that looks awkward, with actors clearly struggling to maintain their positions and expressions looking strained. Wan's solution was innovative. Much of what appears to be underwater footage was actually filmed in air, with the actors performing against green screen while various rigs and harnesses gave them the freedom of movement they needed. Their hair was then digitally manipulated in post-production to flow and move as it would in water. This approach allowed the actors to give full performances without the limitations of actually being submerged, and the result looks remarkably convincing. The visual effects team, led by Kelvin McElwain, did extraordinary work in blending the practical and digital elements seamlessly, creating an underwater world that feels genuinely immersive rather than obviously artificial. The costume design for Aquaman deserves its own discussion because it represents one of the most ambitious and successful aspects of the film's production design. Creating costumes that needed to work both in and out of water, that needed to convey the visual identity of multiple distinct underwater kingdoms, and that needed to look spectacular on screen, while also allowing actors to move freely and perform action sequences, was an enormous challenge. Costume designer Kim Barrett rose to that challenge brilliantly. The various Atlantean costumes blend organic textures, iridescent materials, and intricate details that suggest a civilization that has evolved alongside the ocean rather than apart from it. Arthur's iconic orange and green suit, which pays direct homage to the classic comic book design, appears in the film's final act and is handled in a way that manages to make the famously divisive color scheme look genuinely cool. The suit is given a mythological weight in the story, presented as the armor of the ancient king, which helps sell it to audiences who might otherwise have been skeptical about seeing Momoa in something that closely resembles the original comic book look. The music of Aquaman is another element that contributes enormously to the film's success, and composer Rupert Gregson-Williams delivered a score that perfectly captures the epic, adventurous tone Wan was going for. Gregson-Williams crafted themes that feel genuinely oceanic, using brass and percussion in ways that convey both the grandeur and the danger of the underwater world. The main Aquaman theme is heroic without being pompous, adventurous without being cliched, and it recurs throughout the film in ways that build emotional resonance. The score also does effective work in differentiating between the various underwater kingdoms, giving each location its own musical identity that reinforces the visual distinctiveness of the world design. Beyond the orchestral score, the film also makes interesting use of licensed music, including a memorable moment where Pitbull's cover of Africa by Toto plays during one of the film's most enjoyable action sequences, a creative choice that perfectly encapsulates the film's sense of humor and willingness to have fun with itself. Let's talk about the action sequences, because this is where Aquaman genuinely sets itself apart from much of the competition in the superhero genre. James Wan choreographed and filmed action with a clarity and creativity that makes each sequence feel distinct and memorable. The opening sequence, where Arthur single-handedly takes on a group of pirates aboard a submarine, immediately establishes the scale of his power and Momoa's physical presence in the role. It's a visceral, kinetic sequence that shows you exactly what kind of movie you're in for. But even this impressive opening is topped by what comes later. The Sicily rooftop chase sequence is a particular highlight. A brilliantly staged pursuit through the winding streets and across the terracotta rooftops of an Italian coastal town, with Mera and Arthur being pursued by the secondary antagonist, Black Manta. The sequence is filled with inventive moments, including a memorable bit where Mera creates a weapon from the water inside the bottles and glasses in a restaurant that perfectly demonstrates her powers while also being genuinely clever. The final battle sequence, which takes place in the ancient kingdom of the deserters and ultimately escalates to involve a massive clash between the forces of multiple underwater kingdoms, is one of the most ambitious action set pieces in recent superhero cinema. Wan shoots it with a sense of scale and chaos that feels overwhelming in the best possible way, while still keeping enough clarity in the staging that you can follow the geography of the battle and understand what's happening at each moment. Black Manta deserves his own discussion because he's one of the most visually striking and narratively interesting secondary characters in the film. Played by Yahya Abdul-Mateen II, Black Manta begins the film as a pirate named David Kane, whose father is lost during Arthur's encounter with the submarine crew in the opening sequence. Consumed by grief and hatred for Arthur, Kane is recruited by Orm and given access to Atlantean technology, which he uses to construct his iconic helmet and weaponry. The Black Manta suit, when it finally appears in its full form, is genuinely spectacular, a massive, intimidating piece of technology that looks like something straight out of a nightmare and is rendered with tremendous detail and craftsmanship. Abdul-Mateen II plays Kane with a focused, almost quiet intensity that makes him feel genuinely threatening despite his relatively limited screen time. The character's personal vendetta against Arthur gives the film an additional emotional through line beyond the Orm conflict and sets up Black Manta as a future antagonist in a way that feels organic rather than forced. Abdul-Mateen II has spoken about wanting to explore the character further in future films, and based on his performance here, audiences would absolutely welcome that. One of the aspects of Aquaman that doesn't always get enough credit is the film's handling of its themes, particularly those relating to identity, belonging, and responsibility. Arthur's central conflict throughout the film isn't primarily with Orm or with Black Manta. It's with himself. He's a man who has spent his entire adult life refusing to engage fully with either half of his heritage. He loves his father and the surface world, but he's never fully human. He has immense power and a legitimate claim to the throne of Atlantis, but he's resisted that claim because accepting it would mean accepting a world that, in his view, abandoned him when his mother was taken away. The film traces Arthur's journey from this state of willful disengagement to genuine acceptance of who he is and what his responsibilities are. It's a coming-of-age story, in the truest sense, even if the protagonist is technically an adult. The moment when Arthur finally accepts his destiny and commits fully to being the king his people need is genuinely moving. And it works because the film has done the work of earning that emotional beat through everything that came before it. The relationship between Arthur and his father Tom is one of the film's most touching elements, and Temuera Morrison does wonderful work in the role with the screen time he's given. Tom Curry is a humble man, a lighthouse keeper, who fell in love with a mysterious woman from the sea and was left to raise their extraordinary son alone. But he never resented his situation, never tried to suppress Arthur's gifts or steer him away from his true nature. Morrison plays Tom with a quiet dignity and warmth that makes every scene between him and Momoa feel genuinely heartfelt. The dynamic between Tom and Arthur tells us everything we need to know about why Arthur is the way he is: adventurous but fundamentally decent, physically powerful but emotionally open. Tom gave his son roots, even when everything else in Arthur's life was pulling him in multiple directions. And that foundation is what ultimately allows Arthur to grow into the hero the story needs him to be. Let's shift our focus to the film's visual effects, because discussing Aquaman without spending serious time on this topic would be like discussing a masterpiece painting while ignoring the brushwork. The VFX in Aquaman represent some of the most ambitious and technically accomplished work in the history of superhero cinema. The task of creating fully realized underwater kingdoms populated with thousands of Atlanteans, marine creatures, various underwater vehicles and weapons, all while maintaining a coherent and beautiful visual style, was immense. Industrial Light and Magic, Scanline VFX, and several other visual effects houses contributed to the film's nearly 2,000 visual effects shots. What makes the VFX work in Aquaman stand out from so many other effects, heavy blockbusters, is the artistry behind it. Every frame of the underwater sequences has been designed with genuine aesthetic intentionality, with lighting, color, and composition that create a consistently beautiful visual experience. The bioluminescent quality of much of the underwater world gives it an otherworldly beauty that feels genuinely alien while remaining visually accessible. The cinematography of Don Burgess is a crucial element in making all of those visual effects land as effectively as they do. Burgess brought a sweeping, epic visual sensibility to the film that gives it the scale and grandeur the material demands. His work in the surface world sequences is clean and grounded, which provides an effective contrast with the more fantastical underwater sequences. When the film transitions between these two worlds, Burgess's camera work helps signal the shift in register, using different color temperatures and shooting styles to reinforce the sense that these are genuinely different environments with different rules. In the underwater sequences, Burgess works with a looser, more dynamic style that gives the action a sense of weightlessness and freedom appropriate to the setting. His collaboration with Wan is evident throughout, with the two clearly sharing a common vision for how the film should look and feel. Color plays an enormous role in establishing the visual identity of Aquaman, and the film's color palette is one of its most distinctive features. Rather than the desaturated, murky color grading that plagued many early DCEU films, Aquaman embraces richness and vibrancy, using deep blues and greens for the underwater sequences while allowing warm golds and oranges to dominate in scenes set on the surface. The various underwater kingdoms each have their own dominant color scheme that reinforces their distinct identities. Atlantis gleams with silver and blue light. The kingdom of the fishermen glows with soft, warm bioluminescence. The trench is dark and red-tinged, immediately signaling danger. This deliberate use of color as a world-building tool is something Wan clearly understood from his horror work, where color and light are used to set emotional tone and guide audience response. In Aquaman, this instinct is applied to a much brighter, more optimistic canvas, and the results are stunning. Now let's talk about the film's pacing, which is something that divides some critics but generally works well for the kind of film Aquaman is trying to be. The movie runs approximately 2 hours and 23 minutes, which puts it at the longer end for superhero films. Some critics felt that certain sections, particularly the middle portion involving the quest for the Trident, could have been trimmed. But this longer runtime also gives the film room to breathe in ways that shorter superhero films often don't. The world building has space to develop naturally rather than feeling rushed. Character relationships have time to evolve organically. The mythology of Atlantis can be established with enough detail that the film's climax carries genuine weight. Wan uses the runtime purposefully, understanding that an epic adventure story needs a certain scope and scale to deliver on its promise. The film never feels boring or padded, even at its longest, because each sequence is advancing either the plot, the character development, or the world building in meaningful ways. The humor in Aquaman is another aspect that contributes significantly to the film's broad appeal. DC films have sometimes struggled with tonal consistency, swinging between grim seriousness and jarring comedy in ways that don't always feel natural. Aquaman manages this balance considerably better than many of its DCEU contemporaries. The humor arises naturally from character and situation rather than feeling grafted on to lighten a story that's otherwise too dark. Momoa's natural wit and charisma give Arthur a genuine sense of humor that feels authentic to the character, and the fish-out-of-water comedy involving Mera on the surface world is consistently delightful. The film knows when to be funny and when to be serious, and the transitions between these registers are handled smoothly enough that neither undercuts the other. This tonal balance is one of the key reasons the film works for such a wide range of audiences, from children who respond to the adventure and humor to adults who can appreciate the emotional complexity and thematic depth. The film's release strategy and marketing campaign also deserve mention because they contributed significantly to Aquaman's commercial success. Warner Brothers positioned the film as a major event, releasing it in December 2018 during the holiday season when family audiences are at their most active. The marketing leaned heavily into the spectacular visuals of the underwater world, correctly identifying that this was the film's most distinctive selling point and the thing that would get audiences into theaters. The trailers were extremely well crafted, revealing enough of the film's scope and spectacle to generate genuine excitement, while withholding enough of the story to preserve the experience of watching it unfold. The marketing also did smart work in establishing Momoa's Arthur as a fun, approachable hero, addressing the potential concern that Aquaman might feel too weird or too niche for mainstream audiences. The result was one of the most successful marketing campaigns in recent superhero film history, generating enormous anticipation that the film itself then rewarded. The critical reception to Aquaman was generally positive, with the film earning a fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes and strong scores on audience review sites. Critics praised the film's visual ambition, Momoa's charismatic performance, the world-building, and James Wan's direction. The most common criticism was that the story was somewhat formulaic, relying on familiar heroes' journey tropes without pushing them in particularly unexpected directions. Some critics also felt that the film was occasionally overcrowded, trying to introduce too many kingdoms, too many characters, and too much mythology in a single film. These are fair criticisms, but they need to be weighed against what the film was genuinely trying to accomplish. Aquaman was essentially creating an entire civilization from scratch for a mainstream audience, and the fact that it succeeded as well as it did in that task is genuinely remarkable. The critical consensus largely acknowledged that whatever its narrative limitations, Aquaman was an extraordinary achievement in spectacle filmmaking and a genuinely enjoyable cinematic experience. The audience response was even more enthusiastic than the critical reception, and this enthusiasm was reflected in the film's extraordinary box office performance. Aquaman became the highest-grossing DCEU film of all time, surpassing even The Dark Knight Rises and Batman vs. Superman, to earn over $1 billion worldwide. This made it one of the highest-grossing superhero films in history and one of the most successful comic book adaptations ever made. The performance in international markets was particularly strong, with China representing a massive portion of the global gross. Warner Brothers had invested significantly in making the film appeal to Chinese audiences, filming sequences in China and casting Chinese actress Ludi Lin as Mera, and that investment clearly paid off. The global success of Aquaman demonstrated that the underwater world James Wan had created had genuine universal appeal that transcended cultural and national boundaries. The film's success also sparked significant discussion about representation and diversity in superhero cinema. Jason Momoa himself is of Hawaiian and European descent, bringing an indigenous Polynesian heritage to a major superhero role that was historically portrayed as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed character in the comics. This casting was widely celebrated as an important step toward greater diversity in superhero films, and Momoa has spoken eloquently about what it means to him to represent Pacific Islander heritage in this way. The film's international cast, which also includes actors of Maori, Filipino, and Samoan descent, reflects a commitment to diversity that feels genuine rather than tokenistic, and this inclusivity undoubtedly contributed to the film's global appeal. Seeing heroes who don't conform to the traditionally narrow definition of what a superhero looks like is genuinely exciting, and Momoa's Aquaman represents a meaningful expansion of what these stories can look like and who they can speak to. Let's now discuss the secondary world-building elements that make Atlantis feel like a truly lived-in civilization rather than just a backdrop for action sequences. The Atlantean military, for example, is rendered with impressive detail, using creatures like great white sharks and enormous crustaceans as mounts alongside various forms of underwater technology. The political structure of the underwater kingdoms, with various rulers who have their own interests and alliances, feels genuinely complex in ways that make the world feel larger than any single story could contain. The ancient history of Atlantis, hinted at through various artifacts, and the mythology surrounding the trident, suggests a civilization with thousands of years of culture and tradition behind it. Even the language and technology of Atlantis, which clearly represents an advanced civilization in many ways, while also retaining a kind of organic, natural quality distinct from surface world technology, is handled with thoughtful attention to internal consistency. The trench sequence deserves its own moment of attention because it represents one of the most distinctive and genuinely thrilling segments in the film. When Arthur and Mera travel through the trench, the deepest and most dangerous part of the ocean, in search of a path to the legendary Lost Kingdom, they encounter the trench dwellers, terrifying creatures that evolved from ancient Atlanteans who were driven mad by the pressures of the deep. This sequence carries a genuine horror edge that reflects James Wan's background and is completely earned within the context of the film. The trench creatures are genuinely frightening, designed with enough biomechanical detail to feel like real organisms that have adapted to their extreme environment. The way Arthur and Mera escape the trench, using a flare signal to light their way and drive back the creatures, is one of the film's most creative and satisfying problem-solving moments. It's a sequence that reminds you that the best adventure films aren't just about overwhelming enemies with power. They're about finding clever solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The discovery of the lost kingdom of the deserters is one of the film's most visually spectacular moments, and it's set up beautifully by everything that comes before it. When Arthur and Mera emerge from the trench into this hidden realm, the visual transition is breathtaking, going from the dark horror of the trench to the warm, amber-lit grandeur of an ancient civilization preserved in perfect isolation. The kingdom is built into the walls of an enormous underwater cavern, and the scale of the design makes it feel genuinely ancient and magnificent. The revelation that the kingdom is protected by the Carathen, a giant creature that can speak and that serves as the guardian of the trident, adds a wonderful mythological dimension to this section of the film. Julie Andrews voices the Carathen, and it's a casting choice that manages to be both surprising and completely perfect. The creature's ancient knowing presence gives this sequence the quality of a genuine myth rather than a simple plot device. The final confrontation between Arthur and Orm is handled with real dramatic skill, set against the backdrop of the massive underwater battle between the allied kingdoms and the forces of Atlantis. Their duel, which mirrors an earlier training sequence that established the rules of Atlantean combat, carries genuine weight because the film has built their rivalry with sufficient care that the stakes feel personal rather than purely political. Wilson and Momoa are both physically imposing actors who commit fully to the choreography of the fight, and the sequence is shot and edited with the kind of clarity that allows you to follow every move while still feeling the impact and scale of the confrontation, the resolution of the conflict, which avoids the kind of brutal finality that might have made the film feel darker than it wanted to be, feels right for the tone the movie has established throughout. Orm's final fate leaves open the possibility of future development for the character, which is both dramatically satisfying and narratively smart. The film's ending is one of its most emotionally satisfying moments, bringing together the various threads of Arthur's story in a way that feels both inevitable and genuinely moving. The reunion of Arthur with his mother Atlanta, who was believed to have been executed years earlier, but who in fact survived and was sent to the trench as punishment, is handled with a simplicity that lets the emotional resonance speak for itself. Momoa and Nicole Kidman, who plays Atlanta with tremendous dignity and warmth, share a moment that is quietly devastating in its understatement. The subsequent scene where Atlanta reunites with Tom Curry is equally beautiful. A reminder that beneath all the spectacle and mythology, Aquaman is fundamentally a story about family and belonging. The final image of Arthur in his full Aquaman armor, claiming his identity as both King of Atlantis and protector of the surface world, is triumphant in exactly the right way, the culmination of everything the film has worked to build. Nicole Kidman's performance as Queen Atlanta deserves more attention than it typically receives, partly because the role appears relatively briefly, but makes an outsized impact on the film's emotional landscape. Kidman plays Atlanta as a woman of genuine royal bearing, but also of deep humanity, someone who made an impossible choice and has lived with the consequences for decades. The opening sequence, which shows Atlanta's arrival on the Maine coast and her relationship with Tom Curry, is one of the film's most charming and effective passages. Kidman brings a kind of otherworldly grace to the role while keeping Atlanta entirely sympathetic and grounded in emotional truth. Her chemistry with Momoa in their later scenes together is wonderful, with the awkwardness of their reunion handled with a gentle humor that never diminishes the genuine pathos of the moment. Dolph Lundgren's appearance as King Nereus is one of the film's more delightful pieces of casting, bringing a kind of nostalgic pleasure to a character who functions primarily as a political player in the underwater kingdom power dynamics. Lundgren, of course, is best known from the action films of the 80s and 90s, and seeing him in a major studio superhero film surrounded by elaborate visual effects is a kind of low-key joy for anyone who grew up with those earlier films. He plays the role with appropriate gravity and a hint of the imperious arrogance that makes Nereus an effective supporting antagonist. The character's arc within the film follows a fairly predictable trajectory, but Lundgren handles it with professionalism and brings a genuine physical presence to the underwater battle sequences. Let's talk about how Aquaman functions as a piece of the larger DCEU puzzle, because while the film absolutely works as a standalone story, it exists within a broader cinematic universe that gives certain elements additional context and meaning. Arthur's appearance in Justice League, where he's initially reluctant to join the superhero team before ultimately committing to the cause, is referenced lightly enough that viewers who haven't seen that film aren't left confused, while those who have seen it appreciate the continuity. The film also establishes the world of Atlantis in ways that clearly set up future stories, from the unresolved arc of Black Manta to various references to other underwater kingdoms that haven't been fully explored. The post-credits scene, which shows Black Manta's recovery and sets him up as a continuing antagonist, is one of the more effective examples of this kind of sequel baiting scene in recent superhero films, because the setup feels organic rather than forced and leaves audiences genuinely curious about where the story goes next. The film's approach to its comic book source material is worth examining in some detail, because the creative team made some interesting choices about which elements of the Aquaman mythology to adapt and which to leave aside or transform. The character of Aquaman in the comics has had various different interpretations over the decades, from the cheery, somewhat campy hero of the Silver Age to the more gritty and complex character of various modern runs. The film draws most heavily from Jeff Johns' acclaimed run on Aquaman from the early 2010s, which reimagined the character with more depth and gave the mythology of Atlantis considerably more detail and internal logic. Johns was actually involved in the production of the film in his capacity as DC's chief creative officer, which helps explain the thoughtful fidelity to the better elements of the comics mythology. The film also draws on elements from other Aquaman runs, including aspects of the Trident mythology and the various underwater kingdoms, while adapting them freely to serve the needs of a cinematic narrative. The film's treatment of the ocean itself is something that resonates beyond the pure entertainment value of the story. James Wan has spoken about wanting the film to inspire a genuine sense of wonder and protectiveness toward the real oceans, and in this goal, Aquaman succeeds remarkably well. Seeing the beauty and the life of the underwater world rendered in such spectacular detail, even in fantastical form, inspires a genuine appreciation for what the real oceans contain and why they're worth protecting. Orm's argument about the damage that surface dwellers have done to the sea is not without validity, even in the context of a superhero story, and the film is smart enough to acknowledge this rather than dismissing the villain's perspective entirely. There's a subtle environmentalist undercurrent running through the film that never becomes preachy, but adds a layer of real-world resonance to the fantasy. The film also does interesting work in subverting certain superhero film conventions while embracing others. The classic mentor figure in Vulko is present, but is given complications that prevent him from being simply a Yoda-like guide figure. The love interest in Mera is present, but is so active and capable that she frequently seems like the more competent member of the pair. The villain in Orm has genuine motivations that the film doesn't entirely dismiss as wrong. These nuances aren't revolutionary, but they suggest a creative team that was thinking carefully about how to tell a superhero story in ways that feel fresh and engaging, rather than simply going through the expected motions. The result is a film that works both as a crowd-pleasing entertainment and as a slightly more thoughtful exploration of its material than the genre typically delivers. Looking at Aquaman in the broader context of superhero cinema in 2018, it arrived in a year that also saw Black Panther, Avengers: Infinity War, and Incredibles 2, among others. It was a crowded and competitive landscape for superhero films, with audiences having more options than ever before. The fact that Aquaman managed not only to find its audience, but to become one of the highest-grossing films of the year is a testament to how effectively James Wan and his team delivered on the promise of the material. In a year full of excellent superhero films, Aquaman distinguished itself through sheer visual ambition and the freshness of its underwater world, offering something genuinely different from what Marvel and other DC films were providing at the same time. The film's legacy in the years since its release has been significant. It established Jason Momoa's Aquaman as one of the most popular characters in the DCEU, inspiring theme park attractions, merchandise, and considerable fan affection. It also demonstrated that even characters with reputations as second-tier heroes could carry enormously successful standalone films if the creative team committed fully to the material. The success of Aquaman arguably opened the door for other supposedly difficult superhero properties to be developed with the same ambition and conviction. The film's influence can be seen in how studios approached subsequent superhero films that, like Aquaman, required building entirely new worlds from scratch. There's also something genuinely refreshing about how unapologetically fun Aquaman allows itself to be. In an era when many blockbusters were trying to deconstruct or subvert the superhero genre, Aquaman embraced it with genuine enthusiasm. This isn't a film that's embarrassed about being a superhero movie. It's a film that loves being a superhero movie and wants the audience to love it too. That enthusiasm is infectious, and it's one of the key reasons the film works so well across such a wide demographic range. Children can respond to the adventure and the spectacular visuals. Adults can appreciate the world building and the character work. Comic book fans can enjoy the faithful adaptation of their favorite mythology, and newcomers to the material can be swept up in the story without needing any prior knowledge. This universal accessibility, achieved without dumbing anything down, is one of Aquaman's genuine achievements. Looking back at the film from the perspective of everything that followed in the DCEU, Aquaman represents something of a high watermark, if you'll pardon the obvious pun, in the franchise's history. It combined commercial success with critical respect in a way that demonstrated what the DCEU could accomplish when creative vision and studio confidence aligned properly. James Wan delivered exactly the film he set out to make: a grand, spectacular, emotionally satisfying underwater epic that honored its source material while creating something genuinely cinematic and new. Whether you're a longtime fan who grew up reading Aquaman comics or someone who had never given the character a second thought before 2018, the film offers a genuinely rewarding experience that holds up remarkably well on repeat viewing. And honestly, that's the best compliment you can give any film. Not that it was perfect, not that it reinvented the wheel, but that it's a movie you want to return to. A movie where the world is so rich and the characters are so enjoyable that spending 2.5 hours with them feels like time genuinely well spent. Aquaman achieves that, and in doing so, it makes a strong case for why these stories of extraordinary heroes in impossible worlds continue to resonate with audiences around the globe. So, if you haven't seen it, what are you waiting for? And if you've already seen it, maybe it's time for another dive. There's something else worth mentioning that often gets overlooked in the broader conversation about Aquaman, and that's how the film handles the idea of legacy. Not just Arthur's personal legacy as the heir to the Atlantean throne, but the legacy of the world itself. The oceans in this film aren't just a backdrop or a setting. They're almost a character in their own right, ancient and mysterious and full of history that predates anything humanity has built on the surface. When Arthur swims through the ruins of old Atlantis or navigates the boundaries between kingdoms that have existed for thousands of years, you get this genuine sense of depth, both literally and figuratively. James Wan understood that the most compelling aspect of the Aquaman mythology isn't the superhero action, impressive as it is. It's the idea that beneath the surface of our world, there is an entire civilization that has been living, evolving, and building its own history completely parallel to ours. That concept is inherently fascinating, and the film leans into it with admirable commitment. One of the things that separates Aquaman from a lot of its superhero contemporaries is the sheer density of its imagination. Most superhero films are set primarily in recognizable versions of our world, with just enough fantastical elements layered on top to establish the genre. Aquaman goes in a completely different direction, essentially saying that 2/3 of our planet is a completely different world that we know almost nothing about, and then proceeding to fill that world with extraordinary detail. Every time you think the film has shown you everything it has to offer visually, it turns a corner and gives you something new. A new kingdom, a new creature, a new piece of Atlantean technology or architecture that makes you stop and think about the creative minds that invented it. This density of imagination is genuinely rare in mainstream blockbuster filmmaking, where the tendency is often to simplify and streamline in the interest of accessibility. Aquaman bets that audiences are willing to engage with complexity and richness if it's presented entertainingly enough, and that bet pays off handsomely. It's worth spending a moment on the film's approach to exposition, because handling exposition in a film this packed with world building is genuinely tricky. Get it wrong, and you end up with scenes that feel like a character is reading from a textbook while everyone else stands around nodding. Get it right, and the information flows naturally through the story in ways that inform and engage rather than lecture. Aquaman gets it mostly right, which is no small achievement. The film's backstory is delivered through a combination of gorgeous animated sequences, flashbacks that feel emotionally grounded rather than purely informational, and dialogue that reveals world details through character interaction rather than direct address to the audience. The scene where young Arthur first discovers the extent of his abilities at an aquarium is a perfect example of this approach. It tells us something important about his powers and his relationship with marine life, but it does so through a moment that is funny, charming, and character-defining, rather than simply explanatory. That's smart storytelling, and it reflects a genuine understanding of how to communicate information cinematically, rather than just verbally. The aquarium scene, since we're talking about it, is one of the film's most purely delightful moments, and one that perfectly encapsulates why Momoa's casting was so inspired. Young Arthur is on a school field trip, and when a great white shark in one of the tanks begins communicating with him, the boy's awestruck wonder at his own abilities is both funny and genuinely moving. It's a small scene in the grand scheme of the film, but it does enormous work in establishing who Arthur is before the superhero elements fully kick in. You see a kid who is already slightly apart from his peers, already sensing that he's different, but who responds to that difference with curiosity and openness rather than fear. That psychological foundation, that fundamental openness to the extraordinary, is what defines Arthur Curry as a hero. Not just his physical strength or his connection to the ocean, but his willingness to embrace the unexpected with a grin rather than a flinch. The film's use of flashbacks more broadly is something that works consistently well throughout. Rather than front-loading all the backstory in a lengthy prologue that might exhaust the audience's patience before the main story even begins, Aquaman doles out its history gradually, revealing information about Arthur, Atlanta, and the world of Atlantis, at moments when that information carries the most emotional weight. The revelation about what actually happened to Atlanta after she returned to the underwater kingdom, for example, is held back until the point in the story where its impact on Arthur's emotional journey is greatest. This structural approach to backstory reflects a confidence in the audience's ability to hold open questions in mind without feeling confused or frustrated, and it's the right call. The film trusts viewers to engage actively with its story rather than spoon-feeding every piece of information the moment it becomes relevant. Speaking of structural choices, let's talk about the decision to give Aquaman a genuinely global scope in terms of its surface world settings. The film doesn't just take place in one city or one country. It moves through Maine, the Sahara Desert, Sicily, and various ocean locations, giving it the feel of a real international adventure in the classic Hollywood tradition. This globe-trotting quality is something that films like the Indiana Jones series perfected, and Aquaman clearly loves that tradition. The Sicily sequence in particular feels like a loving tribute to the adventure films of the past, with its rooftop chase through gorgeous Mediterranean architecture, its local color, and its sense of a world that exists independently of the superhero story that happens to be moving through it. The Sahara sequence, where Mera and Arthur follow ancient clues toward the location of the Lost Kingdom, has a similarly classic adventure feel. Two unlikely companions deciphering a mystery in a breathtaking landscape. These sequences ground the film's more fantastical elements in a sense of physical reality that makes the underwater world feel even more wondrous. By contrast, there's a brilliant sense of geography that runs through Aquaman that you don't always appreciate on a first viewing, but becomes increasingly impressive when you think about it. The film is essentially telling a story that spans the entire planet, from the surface world that Arthur knows to the various underwater kingdoms that exist alongside it. Each location, whether surface or subsurface, is established with enough visual specificity that you always have a clear sense of where you are and how it relates to where you've been. Juan and his team clearly did extensive work in thinking through the spatial logic of their world, ensuring that the geography of Atlantis and its neighboring kingdoms makes intuitive sense even though it's entirely invented. This kind of attention to spatial coherence is one of those things that audiences feel subconsciously, even when they can't articulate it. And it contributes significantly to the overall sense that this is a real, fully realized world, rather than a series of impressive but disconnected visual ideas. Now, let's circle back to something that was touched on earlier, but deserves more thorough exploration, and that's the relationship between Aquaman and the broader environmental conversation happening in the real world. Released in 2018, the film arrived at a moment when public awareness about ocean health was at an all-time high. The problem of plastic pollution in the oceans had received enormous media attention in the preceding years, and the health of coral reefs and marine ecosystems was a subject of genuine global concern. In this context, a major Hollywood blockbuster that celebrated the beauty and importance of the ocean world, and that gave its villain motivations rooted in genuine frustration with humanity's mistreatment of the sea, carried a resonance that went beyond pure entertainment. James Wan has been careful not to overstate the film's environmental message, understanding that hammering audiences over the head with a message is the surest way to make them tune it out. But the environmental awareness is woven subtly into the fabric of the story in ways that add meaning without becoming burdensome. The character of Orm in this context takes on additional dimensions that make him one of the more thoughtful villain constructions in recent superhero cinema. When he makes his case to the other underwater kings for going to war against the surface world, listing the various ways in which humanity has damaged the oceans through pollution and careless extraction of resources, the speech is written and performed in a way that acknowledges the validity of the underlying concern, even while rejecting the extreme response Orm proposes. Patrick Wilson plays this moment with a genuine conviction that makes you feel the force of the argument rather than simply dismissing it as villain speak. There's something genuinely uncomfortable about sitting in a movie theater watching a villain make points you intellectually agree with while proposing solutions you obviously can't endorse. That discomfort is exactly the kind of thing good storytelling is supposed to generate, and it speaks to the ambition of what Aquaman is trying to do beneath its spectacular surface. The production design of Atlantis itself, in a way, reflects this environmental theme through its aesthetic choices. Atlantis doesn't look like a human city transplanted underwater. It looks like a civilization that evolved within the ocean, that incorporated marine elements into its architecture and technology, that worked with the natural world rather than against it. The organic quality of Atlantean design, with its flowing curves, its use of natural materials, and its apparent harmony with the underwater environment, implicitly contrasts with the more angular industrial aesthetic of surface world technology. It's a subtle visual argument that there are other ways of building a civilization, other ways of relating to the natural world, and that what Atlantis represents isn't just a fantasy, but perhaps a kind of ideal that the real world has moved away from. Whether audiences consciously register this argument or simply respond to the beauty of the design, the effect is the same. Let's talk about the film's score in a bit more depth, because Rupert Gregson-Williams' work deserves more credit than it typically gets in discussions of the film. Film scores for big superhero blockbusters are often criticized for being forgettable, for providing appropriate noise and emotional cues without creating anything that sticks in the mind after you leave the theater. Gregson-Williams avoided this trap with Aquaman by creating themes that are genuinely distinctive and that carry real emotional weight. The main Aquaman theme has a quality of ancient grandeur, something that suggests vast oceanic depths and centuries of history, while still being energetic and propulsive enough to work as an action theme. The love theme that develops between Arthur and Mera is more intimate and tender, grounding the film's most personal moments with appropriate emotional color. And the more menacing themes associated with Orm and the threat of war have a martial ceremonial quality that reinforces the political and military dimensions of the conflict. Throughout the film, Gregson-Williams shows a real sensitivity to how music can enhance storytelling without overwhelming it, knowing when to step back and let a scene breathe and when to push the emotional temperature higher. The sound design of Aquaman is equally impressive and equally under-discussed. Creating a convincing sonic world for an underwater civilization requires solving some genuinely tricky problems. Real underwater sound is distorted and limited in ways that would make for a deeply unsatisfying film experience if reproduced faithfully. At the same time, making everything sound exactly like it does above water would undermine the sense of a genuinely different environment. The sound designers found a brilliant middle ground, creating a sonic palette that has an underwater quality, slightly softened, with unique reverbs and resonances, while still being clear and dramatic enough to support the film's action and dialogue. Different underwater environments have different sonic qualities, with the gleaming halls of Atlantis sounding quite different from the dark caverns of the trench, reinforcing the visual distinctiveness of each location through audio as well. This kind of thoughtful, integrated approach to sound design is something that serious filmmakers care deeply about and that audiences respond to subconsciously, even when they have no idea why one film feels more immersive than another. One more technical aspect of the film that deserves attention is the editing, handled by Kirk Moray. Editing an action-heavy blockbuster with this much material to cover is an enormous challenge, and Moray's work on Aquaman is consistently excellent. The film manages to maintain momentum across its lengthy runtime without ever feeling rushed in the moments that need time to breathe. Action sequences are cut with clarity and energy, prioritizing spatial coherence over the kind of rapid-fire cutting that can make action scenes visually exciting in the moment, but exhausting and disorienting over time. Character scenes are given room to develop naturally, with the editing respecting the rhythm of the performances rather than cutting away before emotions can fully register. The transitions between the film's various tonal registers, from action to humor to genuine pathos, are handled with a smoothness that makes the film feel tonally cohesive even as it moves across a wide emotional range. Moray's work is the kind that goes unnoticed precisely because it's done so well, and that's really the highest compliment you can pay an editor. Now, let's talk about the film's place in the broader cultural conversation about superhero films in the late 2010s, because context matters when you're trying to understand why Aquaman landed the way it did. By 2018, there had been genuine discourse about superhero fatigue, the idea that audiences might eventually tire of the relentless output of comic book films from both Marvel and DC. The success of Black Panther earlier in the year had demonstrated that superhero films could break through this potential fatigue by offering something genuinely distinctive and culturally resonant. Aquaman succeeded through a different approach, by going bigger, stranger, and more visually spectacular than anything the genre had previously attempted. Rather than dialing back the superhero elements to make the film feel more grounded and character-focused, Wan went in the opposite direction, leaning fully into the fantasy and creating something so visually overwhelming that it demanded to be seen on the biggest screen possible. This counterintuitive response to concerns about superhero fatigue turned out to be exactly right for this particular property and this particular moment. The IMAX and large format presentation of Aquaman was particularly impactful, and if you had the opportunity to see the film in one of those formats, you experienced something quite different from a standard theatrical presentation. The expanded aspect ratio of IMAX allowed for even more of the extraordinary underwater imagery to fill the screen, And the enhanced sound system made the film's sonic world even more immersive and enveloping. One shot with IMAX cameras in mind, framing certain sequences specifically to take advantage of the expanded frame. And the results in those presentations were genuinely breathtaking. The recommendation to see Aquaman on the biggest screen available was one that audiences widely followed, contributing to the film's extraordinary theatrical run and its word-of-mouth reputation as a must-see cinema experience. Something that's fun to think about when you watch Aquaman now, with a few years of perspective, is how many of the film's creative choices seemed risky at the time, but look obvious in retrospect. Casting Jason Momoa was seen by some as unconventional, given his relative inexperience as a leading man in major studio films. Using a horror director for a colorful underwater adventure seemed counterintuitive to many industry observers. Going all in on the fantastical elements of Atlantean mythology, rather than softening them for mainstream audiences, was a gamble that could easily have resulted in a film that felt too weird and too dense for broad appeal. Setting the film's climax in an entirely imaginary location rather than a recognizable real-world setting removed a potential point of connection for audiences unfamiliar with the source material. Each of these choices was justified by the creative team as serving the story they wanted to tell, and each of them turned out to be exactly right. There's a lesson there about creative confidence and the value of committing fully to a vision, rather than hedging toward safer choices out of commercial caution. The casting of Yahya Abdul-Mateen II as David Kane, the man who becomes Black Manta, is worth revisiting in this context as well. Abdul-Mateen was not a widely recognized name when Aquaman went into production, and choosing a relatively unknown actor for a role that functions as a significant secondary antagonist could have been a risk. But the performance he delivers is so precise and so compelling that the casting looks like obvious genius in retrospect. Abdul-Mateen brings an intelligence and a specificity to Kane that elevates the character well beyond what a less committed performance would have achieved. His grief and his rage feel real and human rather than simply villainous, which is crucial for a film that wants its antagonists to be genuinely understood rather than simply opposed. The fact that Abdul-Mateen has gone on to become one of the most sought-after actors in Hollywood, appearing in major roles across film and television, suggests that the creative team recognized something in him that the wider industry would eventually come to understand as well. Good casting is genuinely one of the most valuable skills in filmmaking, and Aquaman demonstrates it beautifully across its entire ensemble. Let's think for a moment about what Aquaman means for the superhero genre's relationship with spectacle. There has always been a tension in comic book filmmaking between the desire to tell emotionally grounded, character-driven stories and the pull toward spectacular visual action that the source material demands and audiences expect. Many of the most critically acclaimed superhero films, from The Dark Knight to Logan to Spider-Man into the Spider-Verse, resolve this tension by prioritizing story and character, while using their visual elements in service of those priorities. Aquaman takes a different approach, one that's less commonly celebrated, but equally valid. It says that spectacle itself can be a form of storytelling, that creating a world of genuine visual wonder is a way of communicating things about imagination, about the richness of the natural world, about the breadth of human creative capacity, that a more restrained approach cannot match. Not every superhero film needs to be a psychological deep dive to be valuable. Sometimes what you need is someone to show you something you've never seen before and leave you smiling at the sheer audacity of it. The film's handling of Arthur's dual identity as both a surface dweller and an Atlantean resonates with anyone who has ever felt caught between two worlds or two cultures. This theme of navigating dual heritage, of belonging fully to neither world while being shaped by both, is one that speaks to experiences of cultural hybridity that are genuinely widespread. Arthur's reluctance to embrace his Atlantean heritage isn't simply stubbornness or cowardice. It's a very human response to the complexity of a dual identity, the temptation to simplify by choosing one side over the other rather than doing the harder work of integrating both into a coherent sense of self. The film's ultimate message, that true belonging comes from accepting the whole of who you are rather than selecting the comfortable parts, is one that carries genuine emotional and cultural weight beyond its superhero context. This resonance is part of why Jason Momoa's personal identity has been such a meaningful part of the Aquaman story. As a man of mixed heritage himself, Momoa brings an authenticity to Arthur's struggle with his dual nature that goes beyond what he could achieve through performance alone. When Arthur talks about not fully belonging to either world, Momoa isn't just acting that line. He's drawing on something real, something personal, something that connects the fictional character to the genuine experience of navigating multiple cultural identities in the real world. That connection between actor and role elevates the performance in ways that are difficult to quantify but easy to feel when you're watching the film. It's the kind of authentic resonance that you can't manufacture or fake, and it's one of the many reasons Momoa's Aquaman feels so genuinely alive. There's a generosity to Aquaman as a film that's worth acknowledging, a quality of wanting to give the audience more rather than less. More world, more character, more spectacle, more humor, more emotion. Some critics read this generosity as excess, and there's a version of that critique that's fair. The film is genuinely packed, and there are moments where a tighter edit might have served the story better. But there's also something genuinely admirable about a blockbuster that isn't holding back, that is throwing everything it has at the screen out of a genuine desire to entertain and amaze. In an era when many major studio films feel calculated and cautious, designed by committee to minimize risk rather than maximize excitement, the reckless enthusiasm of Aquaman is genuinely refreshing. It's the cinematic equivalent of a kid at a birthday party who's so excited about everything that they keep accidentally knocking things over, and you can't really be annoyed because the enthusiasm is so genuine and infectious. One final aspect of the film that's worth reflecting on is what Aquaman says about the power of belief in your own story. Throughout the film, Arthur is surrounded by people who believe in him before he believes in himself. Volko has been preparing him for decades. Mera travels across the world to recruit him. His father has always known that his son was destined for something extraordinary. Even the Carathan, who initially tests Arthur's worthiness, ultimately recognizes something in him that Arthur himself has been reluctant to acknowledge. The film's emotional journey is essentially Arthur catching up to everyone else's faith in him, gradually accepting that the story his loved ones have been telling about him is true, that he is genuinely capable of being the hero they need him to be. It's a simple message, perhaps, but it's delivered with such warmth and such conviction that it lands with real force. And in a world where it can sometimes feel hard to believe in anything, there's real value in a film that spends 2.5 hours making a persuasive case for believing in something, whether that's a person, a legacy, or the simple idea that things can be better than they are. And really, when you think about all of it together, the visual ambition, the committed performances, the rich world building, the genuine humor, the emotional honesty, and yes, the absolutely gorgeous spectacle of it all, Aquaman is a film that deserves its place among the best that the superhero genre has produced. It's not perfect. No film is. But it's alive in a way that the best cinema always is, full of energy and imagination and a genuine love for the art of telling stories on the biggest possible canvas. James Wan set out to make something extraordinary, and he did exactly that. Arthur Curry set out to find where he belonged, and by the end of the film, so has the audience. Right here, in the world Wan built for us, watching one of the most entertaining superhero films ever made, and probably already thinking about when to watch it again. That, if nothing else, is the mark of a film that truly delivered on every promise it made. Now, here's something that doesn't get brought up nearly enough when people talk about Aquaman, and that's how the film handles the concept of courage. Not the obvious, punching things kind of courage, though Arthur certainly has plenty of that, but the quieter, more personal kind of courage that involves facing the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Arthur spends most of the film running toward danger without hesitation, diving into situations that would terrify any reasonable person, and doing it all with a grin that suggests he's having the time of his life. But the moment that requires the most genuine bravery in the entire film is the one where he finally allows himself to want something, to want the throne, to want to protect people, to want to be the king his mother always believed he could be. That transition from someone who acts out of obligation or instinct to someone who acts out of genuine, chosen purpose is subtle but enormously important, and Momoa plays it with a restraint that makes the payoff all the more powerful when it finally arrives. That internal journey connects beautifully to something the film does surprisingly well for a movie about a man who can outswim torpedoes, and that's vulnerability. Arthur is physically invulnerable in most conventional senses. He can withstand pressures that would crush a submarine. He can match the strength of virtually any opponent he encounters. But emotionally, he's been incredibly fragile for most of his life, and the film doesn't shy away from showing that. The abandonment of his mother, whether or not it was voluntary on her part, left a wound that never fully healed. His sense of not belonging anywhere, of being too Atlantean for the surface and too human for the depths, is a source of genuine pain that shapes every decision he makes. Momoa doesn't play Arthur as someone who has overcome this pain. He plays him as someone who has learned to function alongside it, to use humor and bravado as a kind of armor. And the moments when that armor slips, when the real cost of Arthur's isolation becomes visible, are some of the most affecting in the film. This emotional authenticity extends to the film's treatment of fatherhood in a way that's genuinely touching. Tom Curry, Arthur's lighthouse keeper father, could easily have been a peripheral figure, a piece of backstory delivered in a brief flashback and then largely forgotten as the story moves toward its underwater adventure. Instead, Juan keeps returning to Tom throughout the film, using him as an anchor point that grounds the entire story in human feeling. Every time the film cuts back to Tom waiting for his son, living his quiet life on the Maine coast with faith that Arthur will find his way, the emotional stakes of the larger adventure are reinforced. Tom's love for his son isn't loud or demonstrative. It's the kind of patient, steady love that simply continues regardless of circumstances, and Temuera Morrison communicates this with beautiful economy. The scenes between Tom and Arthur are few, but they're among the most genuinely moving in the film, and they remind you that beneath all the spectacular mythology and world-ending stakes, this is fundamentally a story about family. Thinking about family in the context of Aquaman naturally leads you to think about how the film handles the complicated relationship between Arthur and Orm, because their dynamic is really the emotional engine of the entire plot. On the surface, their conflict is political. Arthur has the superior claim to the Atlantean throne. Orm wants to use that throne to wage war, and their confrontation is inevitable. But beneath that political conflict is something much more personal and much more interesting. These are two men who share a mother who was taken from both of them in different ways. Orm grew up knowing his mother had abandoned him to return to a world she valued more than him, or at least that's how a child might have processed that loss. Arthur grew up knowing his mother was taken from him by a world he had no access to. Both of them carry wounds from the same source, and both of them have allowed those wounds to shape them in different directions. The tragedy of their relationship is that in a different story, with different choices made along the way, they might have been allies rather than enemies. Patrick Wilson plays the undercurrent of this tragedy with impressive skill, allowing you to see the wounded person beneath the imperious ocean master persona without ever softening the genuine threat that Orm represents. There's a scene early in their confrontation where Orm extends something that might, in the most generous reading, be interpreted as an offer of brotherhood, a chance for Arthur to stand aside and let Orm pursue his vision without conflict between them. Wilson plays the moment with enough ambiguity that you can't quite tell whether it's a genuine gesture or purely a tactical move, and that ambiguity is exactly right. Orm is complex enough that both readings are plausible, and the film is smart enough to leave the question open rather than resolving it in either direction. That's the kind of nuanced villain writing that elevates a superhero film from entertainment to genuine drama. Let's pivot for a moment to talk about something that often goes unacknowledged in discussions of blockbuster filmmaking, and that's the extraordinary collaboration required to make a film of Aquaman's scope actually work. When you're watching the finished product, with its seamless integration of practical and digital elements, its consistent visual style across dozens of wildly different locations, and its coherent tonal identity across nearly 2.5 hours of storytelling, it's easy to forget that what you're seeing is the result of thousands of people working in coordinated effort over several years. The visual effects artists who spent months creating individual creatures and environments. The costume and makeup teams who had to develop entirely new approaches to materials and application for an underwater environment. The stunt coordinators who choreographed action sequences involving actors suspended on wires against green screens, imagining the physics of an environment that behaves completely differently from anything on land. The production designers who built enormous practical sets representing Atlantean architecture. Each of these contributions is invisible in the finished film precisely because they're done so well. And that invisibility is the highest form of craft. The practical set construction for Aquaman was more extensive than many people realize. Given how much of the film's visual world is obviously digital, Wan made a deliberate choice to build as much as practically possible, understanding that actors perform better when they have real environments to interact with, and that even partially practical sets provide a physical grounding that digital environments alone can't quite replicate. The Atlantean throne room, for example, was constructed as a massive practical set that gave Wilson, Momoa, and Dafoe real architecture to inhabit during their scenes, with the digital elements added around and above it in post-production. This hybrid approach to production design is increasingly common in big-budget fantasy filmmaking, but the skill with which it was executed in Aquaman puts it among the best examples of the technique. The result is a world that feels tactile and real, even when you intellectually know that much of what you're seeing exists only as data on a computer server. The hair and makeup department on Aquaman also deserves a special mention, because creating a believable underwater look for an enormous cast across dozens of different kingdoms required solving problems that don't have established solutions. How do you make hair look like it's floating in water when it's not? How do you create makeup that reads correctly under the specific lighting conditions of an underwater environment, while also looking correct when those same characters appear in surface world sequences? How do you develop distinct aesthetic identities for multiple underwater civilizations through hair and makeup choices that feel organic to each culture? The solutions developed by department head Tara McDonald and her team were innovative and often involved techniques specifically created for this film, and the results are visible in every underwater sequence in the form of a consistently believable and beautiful aesthetic that contributes enormously to the sense of entering a real, fully realized world. Now let's talk about something that's genuinely fun to think about, which is the way Aquaman uses humor to deal with the inherent absurdity of its premise. Here's the thing. A movie about an underwater king riding a giant seahorse into battle is objectively ridiculous, and the film knows it. Rather than trying to paper over this with excessive seriousness, the way some superhero films try to make inherently silly concepts seem weighty by draining them of all humor, Aquaman leans into the fun of its own premise with genuine relish. The film is fully aware that it's asking audiences to invest emotionally in a civilization of people who ride sharks to work and use giant crabs as soldiers, and it handles this awareness through a kind of affectionate, self-deprecating humor that never undermines the sincerity of the story, but keeps everything from becoming too pompous. Arthur's tendency to react to genuinely extraordinary things with casual, slightly bemused acceptance rather than wide-eyed amazement is a perfect expression of this tonal choice. He's seen enough of the world, both above and below the waves, to have a pretty healthy perspective on what counts as actually surprising. The humor in Aquaman also serves an important structural function, providing release valves at points in the story where the emotional or action intensity needs to be lowered before the next escalation. This is something Wan learned from horror filmmaking, where moments of levity are used strategically to lower the audience's guard before the next scare. In Aquaman, the same principle applies in reverse. Moments of humor provide breathing room between sequences of intense action or emotional weight, giving the audience permission to relax briefly before the film demands their full engagement again. This rhythmic approach to tone is one of the key reasons the film sustains its energy so effectively over its lengthy runtime. You're never overwhelmed because the film is constantly modulating its intensity, and the humor is the primary tool through which that modulation happens. There's a particularly memorable moment of this kind of tonal modulation in the scene where Arthur and Mera are hiding in a wine cellar in Sicily, taking a brief pause from being pursued by Black Manta, and Mera, encountering a grapevine for the first time, eats a bunch of grapes with the focused intensity of someone conducting a scientific experiment. It's a tiny moment, barely 15 seconds long, but it does so much work. It reminds you of who Mera is, someone from a completely different world encountering ordinary things for the first time with complete seriousness. It lightens the mood after an intense action sequence. It advances the relationship between Arthur and Mera in a small but meaningful way, showing us how he reacts to her genuine wonder at the surface world. And it's genuinely funny, the kind of funny that comes from character rather than from a joke, which is always the best kind. The film is full of moments like this, small, character-specific beats of humor that accumulate into a consistent tonal identity. Let's spend a few minutes thinking about the film's relationship with mythology, because this is an aspect of Aquaman that goes somewhat deeper than the typical superhero film's engagement with its source material. The story of the Trident of Atlan, the ancient weapon of the first king of Atlantis that can only be claimed by a worthy heir, is structured very deliberately as a myth in the classical sense. It has the quality of stories that have been told and retold over generations, accumulating meaning with each retelling, which is exactly what Atlantean mythology should feel like given the civilization's supposed age. The quest for the trident follows the pattern of mythological hero trials, with Arthur having to prove his worthiness not through sheer force, but through something more fundamental about who he is. The Carathin, as the guardian of the trident, functions in the tradition of mythological gatekeepers, testing the hero not to prevent him from claiming his prize, but to ensure that the prize is claimed by someone who deserves it. These mythological structures give the film's adventure plot a resonance that goes beyond the surface level of superhero action, connecting it to storytelling traditions that are genuinely ancient. The film also engages interestingly with the mythology of the ocean itself, drawing on the deep human relationship with the sea that has existed since the earliest human civilizations. The ocean has always been a place of both wonder and fear in human mythology, a source of life and sustenance, but also of storms and mysteries and things that don't come back. Aquaman captures both sides of this ambivalence beautifully. The beauty and richness of the underwater world reflects the ocean as a source of wonder and abundance. The trench and its inhabitants reflect the ocean as a place of primal fear and ancient darkness. The film honors both aspects of this mythological relationship, which gives its world a completeness and a depth that purely wonder-focused or purely horror-focused treatments of the underwater setting couldn't achieve. You believe in this ocean as a real place, partly because it contains both beauty and terror, just like the real thing. One of the subtler pleasures of Aquaman on repeated viewings is noticing how carefully the film sets up elements that pay off later. The film is more tightly constructed than its freewheeling, adventurous tone might initially suggest, with details established early returning in satisfying ways as the story develops. The specific nature of Mera's hydrokinetic powers, demonstrated in small ways early in the film, becomes crucial to the resolution of several later sequences. The mythology of the trident, introduced in broad strokes early on, is progressively elaborated until its full significance becomes clear in the film's climax. The dynamic between Arthur and Orm established in their first meeting shapes every subsequent interaction between them. Even smaller details like the specific properties of Atlantean armor or the behaviors of various marine creatures are set up early and then used to pay off moments later. This careful construction gives the film a satisfying sense of internal logic, making its world feel like a place with consistent rules rather than a series of impressive moments that don't quite add up. The film's approach to scale is something worth marveling at, partly because getting scale right in a film that operates at the level Aquaman does is genuinely difficult. The scope of what's being depicted ranges from the intensely personal, two people talking quietly in a lighthouse, to the almost incomprehensibly vast armies of thousands fighting across the floor of the ocean. Maintaining a consistent sense of human scale within that range, keeping the audience oriented and emotionally connected even when the frame is filled with thousands of computer-generated combatants, is a real challenge. Wan handles it by consistently anchoring the big sequences in the perspectives of individual characters. Even in the massive final battle, the camera keeps returning to Arthur and Mera, to Orm, to specific moments of individual action that keep the human scale of the conflict in view. The audience never loses sight of the personal stakes because the film never loses sight of its characters, even when everything around them is operating at a truly epic scale. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer ambition of the final battle sequence, because it really is one of the most extraordinary pieces of action filmmaking in the superhero genre. The sequence begins with the confrontation between the forces of Atlantis and the combined armies of the allied kingdoms, a clash of submarines and sea creatures and Atlantean warriors that is absolutely overwhelming in its scale and complexity. Then it escalates further, with the ancient creatures of the deep joining the conflict in ways that dramatically shift the balance of power. Then it escalates again, with Arthur's arrival in full king's armor riding the Carathan, fundamentally changing the nature of the confrontation. And through all of this escalation, the film maintains coherent geography, clear character arcs, and genuine emotional stakes. You know who's winning and losing at each point. You understand what the outcome of each phase of the battle means for the characters you care about. And you feel the weight of Arthur's final confrontation with Orm as a personal rather than just a political resolution. Achieving all of that simultaneously in a sequence of this visual complexity is a genuine feat of filmmaking. The resolution of the battle, and specifically the way the various underwater kingdoms respond to Arthur's victory and his claiming of the trident, is handled with a grace note that reflects the film's fundamental optimism. The moment when the assembled forces of the ocean kingdoms recognize Arthur as the true king isn't triumphalist or self-congratulatory. It's quiet and almost reverent, a moment of genuine significance in the mythology of this world. Juan frames it beautifully, with the scale of the assembled forces making clear what this moment represents historically for the world of Atlantis, while the focus on Arthur's face keeps the emotional center of the scene intimate and personal. The transition from this moment to the closing scenes of the film is handled with equally sure-footed grace, bringing the story back to its human roots with the reunion scenes we discussed earlier, and closing on a note that feels earned rather than simply imposed. Something that's particularly worth noting about how Aquaman wraps up its story is the choice to leave certain questions deliberately open. Arthur becomes king of Atlantis, but the film doesn't pretend that this resolves all the tensions between the surface world and the underwater kingdoms. The relationship between the two civilizations remains complicated, with legitimate grievances on multiple sides that won't be resolved simply by having a more sympathetic ruler on the Atlantean throne. This openness is actually narratively sophisticated, acknowledging that the real problems raised by the story, environmental responsibility, political reconciliation, the coexistence of genuinely different civilizations with different needs and values, are bigger than any single hero or any single story can fully resolve. Arthur can be a force for better relations between these worlds, but the work of actually building those better relations is ongoing, and the film respects that reality rather than pretending the happy ending answers all the hard questions. And speaking of hard questions, let's end on one that the film raises implicitly without ever quite articulating directly, which is the question of what we owe to the parts of the world we can't see. The oceans cover most of our planet. They're full of life and mystery and ancient history that humanity is only beginning to understand. Most of us interact with the ocean primarily as a resource, something to fish from or travel across, or, unfortunately, to dispose of things in. Aquaman asks, with the particular authority of spectacular popular entertainment, whether that relationship needs to change, whether there's something underneath, literally and figuratively, that deserves more than casual exploitation. Arthur's journey is ultimately a story about expanding your sense of belonging and responsibility, about recognizing that your world is bigger than the part you've been paying attention to. That's not a bad message for anyone to carry out of a movie theater, whether they're thinking about the ocean, about their community, or about any of the countless ways that our world is richer and more complex than the surface we usually see. So when you put it all together, Aquaman is genuinely more than the sum of its spectacular parts. It's a film that earns its emotion, builds its world with real care, performs at the absolute peak of what blockbuster filmmaking can achieve technically, and still remembers to be an absolute blast to watch from start to finish. James Wan gave us something truly special here, a film that can stand proudly alongside the best of what this genre has ever produced, and a story that continues to grow in appreciation the more time passes and the more clearly we can see how well it all came together. Not bad for a guy who used to talk to fish.